Good morning, and thank you for the invite to come here to talk to you today about the transmission network and tomorrow about the rule book for Europe in context of how to make connections, how to make system operation, how to make markets function in the future, and how to integrate large-scale amount of renewable energy. First, now, however, I'm dealing with the ENTSO-E, which maybe many of you will not know about, but there are 41 TSOs in Europe, and they have come together in a single organization called ENTSO-E, facilitated by law by European Commission, having implemented 10 years ago a requirement to establish ENTSO-E, as well as implementing regulators. So there are the three elements of driving things forward at the central area: the Commission, the transmission companies, and the regulators together. Okay, so what is my agenda? The agenda here is about what the challenges are. I won't, unlike the previous speaker, I will stay clear of formally, but I'll give you a few graphs on what our challenges are and just a few figures. The main focus will be on two elements: the future energy scenarios, and as we just heard from Thomas, having multiple scenarios is the key element. And the further you go into time, the more scenarios you need in order to have robust investments. I will then talk about the networks, and we have a process called TYNDP, 10-year network development plans, which are done biannually, every 2 years. It takes about 2.5, 3 years to produce one of them, so there's even some overlap between one and the next one. I'll talk a bit about the target transfer capacities, the main benefits in supporting the single market, which is the aim from the politicians in Europe. The different technical solutions in the network and the boundaries increasing socioeconomic welfare for the citizens of Europe, and some concluding remarks. I have some additional material that I believe I won't have time to deliver, comparing how well we've done over the last couple of years, the main challenges, and also how we assess the projects in more details, and the process already underway for 2018. So, if we look at the integration of renewable energy sources, the challenges. First of all, on the right, we have variability and uncertainty of intermittency. Secondly, we have a need to enable cross-border flows over long distances to take advantage of the variety of generation and mix of patterns. Why do we have all of those now more than in the past? Well, on the left, you will see that we have up to 50% of renewable energy being introduced by 2030, which is the main focal point here. And 350 additional gigawatts of wind and solar PV for the whole of Europe, on top of 260 gigawatt already in place, so more than doubling. We are looking at an investment of 150 billion euros, roughly aligned to US dollars, and about half of that by 2030. So developing of the transmission network is one of the key enablers to cope with these challenges and seize the new opportunities. I'll talk tomorrow about another enabling, the rule books. So the TYNDP has a bit more than 2 years to prepare. Scenario development is in the first year, and followed by project identification, and then second year focus on assessing individual projects, cost-benefit assessment. In the past, there was less finance-based cost assessment. Now, the 8 previous factors have been turned into monetary assessments, and associated with all of this is extensive communication with stakeholders, including informal and also formal public consultation as shown here. So, what about the scenarios themselves? Well, key questions is, what will 2020 and 2030 look like? What are the parameters that needs to be considered? In the short term, today and even out to 2020, things are pretty well known. Single scenario is adequate. When you go another 10 years, the big uncertainties happen. And therefore, we need more visions for the future in order to have robust investments that are adequate in a range of different futures. Fast or slow development in renewable energy is one such. Strong or weak cooperation between the countries across Europe is one other factor. And here we look a bit more into the steps of creating each vision, creating a storyline for each of the different visions. Into that goes the economical background, which can develop in different ways, the demand develop in different ways, and take up of new demands and efficiency, for instance, generation and grid will develop in different ways. Throughout this process, extensive stakeholder interaction. So the process goes from storyline through data collection, checks in terms of quality and consistency, and then a mass of simulations, and then ensuring that there is a convergence and adequacy evaluated through that process. And finally, the scenario outputs are prepared. So what visions do we have in the 2060 TYNDP? Well, we've got 4 visions for 2030. The slowest progression one has little European coordination and little progress towards the 2050 environmental targets. By contrast, in Vision 4, European Green Revolution, we are achieving high elements of both of those. If we look across the four elements here, slowest through to the fastest, Vision 1 through to Vision 4, we can then look at more parameters in terms of how they are defined, the storyline for each of them. And here in the second page, I'm just showing, for instance, electric vehicles. The second line here, we see from slow progression, assuming that there is no progression of electrical take-up, and by contrast, in Vision 4, we have electrical plug-in vehicles taken up in the 20%, and on this occasion also including generating back vehicle-to-grid facilities. And in the heat pumps here, we again start from 0 and go up to 10% transition from heat across to electricity heat pumps. So different visions covers different futures, and we want to make sure that transmission investments are robust against different futures. In this visualization of the different elements, we have 10 different factors, and high or low elements with each of the 4 visions are identified in there. So if you look at the more specifically on percentage renewable energy, which you have in the horizontal factor here, you see going from low 40s in Vision 1 through to close to 60 for Vision 3 and Vision 4. And if you look at the vertical scale of reducing CO2, then we start again Vision 1 close to 50% reduction, which is some improvement. But in Vision 3 and 4, we are close to 70 to 80% reduction of CO2 by 2030. Here we see at the bottom the capacity. No, not the capacity, the annual generation in terawatt hours across the system in all the 34 countries based on 2020. And the top line is Vision 4. On the left, you will see the what I would call the synchronous generation and the conventional generation, starting with nuclear and then looking at gas and coal. And you can see that between 2020 and 2030, there is a mass, nearly a revolution in shift away from coal to on the top, where coal and lignite is more or less discontinued by 2030. And in my own country, GB, we had 90% generation when we privatized from coal in 1990, and by 2022-23, the last coal-fired station will close. So the transition is a fast one. On the right-hand side, you see the solar PV on the far right, and then the wind, and you see substantial extension of that, varying between the different visions. So what does this mean in context of country-by-country impact? Because the main focal point on the TYNDP is not within countries, but is between countries, and delivering a 15% connectivity between the countries in context of the largest of the full installed capacity. Now, here under Vision 1 and 2, you can see that one example of exporting country is France, because there is a stronger nuclear component, and France is strong in terms of nuclear capacity. And then it varies in the different visions in terms of, as a whole, whether a country is importing or exporting. Obviously, over time, it will change from hour to hour. One of the outputs of the scenarios is what is the installed capacity. Here on the left, we see the 2020 and Vision 4 on the right for each country. All of this data is available, but it's just illustrating here what is done in this process. Then turning the capacity into energy consumption made by running the optimized market over all the hours in the year, and we see how much production there is in 2020 and 2040 by the different sources. If we move on and look at demand, we see the demand is also a single element from in 2020, but 4 different varieties in 2030. And on the right, you see PV and also the wind. PV about 250 and about 350 gigawatts of installed capacity for wind. Here you just see a variation in context of national content of solar PV, country by country. Germany, Spain, a big variation in terms of the scenarios, and Italy, which have a large installation already, 11 gigawatts in a single year of 2011 in Italy on PV. So what does this mean in terms of developing the networks? What are the main elements? Well, interconnection capacity is the main targets, and one element of indicating success in that area is to see that the price differential across Europe diminishes. And we also look at target capacities. So here we are giving for Vision 3 a difference between implementing and not implementing. And my home country, which is Norway, is a hydro-dominated country, and my existing current country is Great Britain. And here we see in red, without the investments, there is a large price differential, whereas this diminishes substantially when the transmission investments are made. Here we see the main boundaries, largely between the synchronous areas. We've got 5 synchronous areas in GB. 5 synchronous areas in Europe, Ireland, GB, Nordic, and continental Europe, by far the largest. We have a ratio of 1 to 10 to 100. Ireland and Baltic countries are on the 1, GB and Nordic are on the 10, and continental Europe is on 100 in that sort of relatively scale. So if you look at the 4 visions in context of the capacity installed, we have Vision 2 requiring the largest installation of more than 13,500 megawatt between GB and continental Europe and Nordic, for instance, compared with about 3 gigawatts at present, so very large installations. In terms of adequacy of these plans, we see here that some are green, adequate in all scenarios, some are adequate in some scenarios, and the red one between France and Spain is not even adequate in a single scenario. So what are the technical solutions implemented in the plan? Well, as you can see with the synchronous areas interconnection, naturally there is a lot of DC involved, but while there's also a large amount of AC connections to be made, and these are predominantly at 400 kV, the main system voltage in Europe. Over time, you see here the spread over time of kilometers installed. And if we go one step further, we see the split in terms of main plant, overhead line, underground cable, and subsea cable, a substantial element of subsea cable to interconnect. And on top of that, also very large HVDC in context of connecting in very large development of offshore wind. And in Germany and Great Britain, also internal, within country, very large HVDC, multi-gigawatt installations within the systems. Phase-shifting transformers to share the power more optimally in the future is part of the scene, and building converters and hence new substations as well. So if you look at the boundaries, increasing socioeconomic welfare for the citizens of Europe is the main focus. And therefore, things are evaluated in context of socioeconomic value, socioeconomic welfare. We have a pan-European scene built upon individual regional activity. If we look at one of those, I've talked a bit about my own world from GB. We see from GB here the vertical scale of socioeconomic welfare, which incidentally used to be not quantified previously, but is now monetized. So at the target capacity of 11 gigawatts, we have between 600 and 1,000 million per year socioeconomic value calculated that would be delivered. Then, I'm not going to go through in detail, we have the similar for lots of different areas around Europe in terms of their socioeconomic value varying between scenarios. And when you pick what your plan is, you need to consider robustness against different futures. And that's what the scenarios delivers for you. So my concluding remarks here are on the TYNDP projects. Europe needs them, and they need to be built. But building in democracy is very, very challenging. If we succeed, we will deliver twice as much interconnection capacity by 2030 as we have now. We will be able to integrate successfully 60% renewable energy sources, and we will deliver a lowering in comparison with not doing this work of €5 per megawatt hour in bulk power prices on the market. And the cost of all of that will be 150 billion in investments, which equates to about 1% on the total electricity cost to end consumers. We need proper return for investors, and we need to gain support from a local community. So, in conclusion, the development of transmission capacity is a major cornerstone to successfully integrate renewable energy. NSOE has been given the task to manage at European level this process, in addition to what is done internally within each of the 34 countries. The process is called TYNDP, and it runs biannually. TYNDP delivers the wires to trade, and the network codes delivers the rules for connection, for system operation, and for markets, and we'll talk about those tomorrow. And these two elements together facilitate means of coping with high RES capability and variability. And in future, up towards full 100% penetration of RES at some periods in time is what we're working on at present. TYNDP process aims to deliver socioeconomic welfare to the citizens of Europe. And I will stop there and leave the additional material for you to look at your leisure time. Thank you.
Questions? I think we can take again one or two questions. The microphone, any question? I have a question, Helge. It's not completely clear to me at the moment how you consider that transmission development, at least in Germany, takes 15 to 20 years. I think in the rest of Europe it's not much faster. So I think for the Indian participants it's important to understand, it was partly mentioned yesterday, that really getting a new overhead transmission line being built in Europe, particularly in Germany, takes really a long time, and there's a high unsecurity in it when you get the final approval. So how do you consider this one in the different scenarios? Is this considered at all?
Well, this is one of the main challenges, and a challenge where the engineers and NSOE need support from the politicians in terms of getting acceptability in the population. And as you talked about yesterday, of the possibility of legal challenges, I have myself looked at the large line in Great Britain, and as early as 1990, I provided to a public inquiry detailed designs and then modified them overnight for the inspector to have them available next morning, thinking that we would get a fast decision. Then we came to think, oh no, maybe the politicians won't be able to take a decision until next election. But what we forgot about was which next election. And it took 10 years to get a planning, and it took 18 months to build it once we had completed. So yes, we are aware of those issues, and we need to improve in those aspects, and it's definitely not easy.
But is it realistic to assume you can make it faster? So you get the approval faster? Because that, I think, was one of the mistakes that were done in Germany with the planning of the HVDC lines, to first assume that can be done by overhead lines, because the public acceptance was, in my opinion, never there.
Some people, some countries have options. So in my current home country, GB, we needed to create another 2.5 gigawatt link between North Scotland, where most of the wind is. 60% of the highest resource in Europe is in Little Scotland, and England. And to get those 2.5 gigawatt, we wanted to build additional lines between England and Scotland, and the conclusion was forget it. So what was online infrastructure was built as a cable in the sea instead between England and Scotland, and is 2.6 gigawatt just about commissioning about now.
Okay.
But so all options you need to think about, and maybe you need to pay some more. And as an example, in GB also, it's assumed that roughly 10% will be forced into cables for environmental reasons, for acceptability. So you may start with a lower, but through public inquiries, you will be forced to do some underground cabling, although the farming community don't like it because it takes up or reduces the flexibility on their land. So there are lots of different issues and a lot of work done in order to learn lessons from the past and to share those lessons across the patch.
Okay, thank you very much, Helge. Any question now there's a question.
Good morning, sir. My question is with respect to the socio-economic welfare or the value that you talked about. So under different scenario, you say this is the kind of socio-economic value that is going to be created. Economic value, to some extent, we do understand in what terms we measure and how do we measure that. But can you illustrate a bit on how did you arrive at the social values that would be created under different scenarios?
Yeah, sorry, I haven't brought any details on that, and maybe my colleague here from Denmark might have a better answer than me. But we started with 8 factors, which just had 1 to 3 in terms of good, indifferent, or bad. And then these have gradually been monetized. And I remember back only about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I said, oh, why don't we have flexibility in there? We talked yesterday extensively about flexibility. And begrudgingly, my colleagues in TSO says, okay, we'll have it, but we'll have it as 8B, as a subset of one element. Maybe with hindsight, because how much benefit in terms of balancing, sharing, international balancing, sharing will we get? So there are lots of factors that are continuously developing, and therefore the rule book in cost-benefit analysis is moving on. And between 2016 and 2018, there is a new set of cost-benefit analysis that's introduced that takes on board stakeholders and others' input into exactly how it should be calculated, and then run through all the projects. And we are already now working at the 2020 version of it because it needs to be there by the beginning of the process for better rules. And the the 2021 will better take account of, for example, contribution to system dynamics. So system dynamics studies are becoming very big when you get close to 100% renewable, and you have a lot of challenges, and these are being brought in 2018 and again in even more in 2020 and into the economical evaluation. So, the basic support to market is obviously the big issue on energy in the first place, the contribution to reducing the price differential, because it's run through based on, Professor Hoffman, on time series-based historical data, and then by the market model, and then assuming by the different options how much improvement it makes, and therefore how much benefit is to the end consumer. But the benefits may be distributed differently, and there is also a problem associated with somebody may be building lines on their territory, but it's somebody else in two ends that have the main benefits. So cost sharing in relation to who's building it and who's benefiting from it is another issue that we're dealing with. Sorry, I haven't fully answered your question, but a lot more of it is available online at ENSOE's website.
Thanks. Thank you.
I'd just like to mention that really it's important that I think there are very detailed documentation on the webpage, on ENSOE's webpage available. So for all of those who are interested, I think you can read the details on the internet. Thank you very much, Helge.